I'm Kira Cleveland, and this is Human Intelligence. With my co-host, Ned Hayes, we talk about the importance of human creativity in the age of AI. Welcome to the future. We want to welcome today Jonathan Boymal to the Human Intelligence podcast. Dr. Boymal is an applied economist specializing in the areas of housing and urban development, cultural and health economics, cost-benefit analysis, and technology diffusion. He's had 25 years of award-winning higher education leadership experience across the Asia-Pacific region. In recent months, he's become a leading thinker in counteracting the spread of artificial intelligence systems into education and learning. At his Substack, The Last Analog, Jonathan explores the intersection of the future of learning, AI, and philosophy through a human-centered lens. We're excited to have you on the show, Dr. Boymal.
Kira, Ned, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. So, just to kick us off with kind of the big question, what got a professor of economics into the game of critiquing and thinking about AI from a skeptical perspective?
Look, that's a great question. Back in 2020, when the pandemic first hit, I watched a movie called Perfect Sense. I don't know if you've seen it. It hasn't been well reviewed on Rotten Tomatoes, but still a great movie. It's also about a pandemic, and in one of the last scenes where people are losing the last of their senses, there's a voiceover, and it says that people were experiencing a shared flinching of the temporal lobe. And what that meant was there was something that was bringing people together, a sense of something happening. And it was quite a beautiful scene. I started writing about sort of human centric issues back then. And then a few years later, ChatGPT emerged. And it
Wow.
was just a natural continuation, to be honest, of
Mhm.
some of the writing that I had done previously. So absolutely, it's not directly related to my discipline, but I think it has profound implications for the future of humanity more generally. And here I'm now at an age, I'm over 50, where I am looking at some of those, those bigger questions, and perhaps not constrained to the same extent by the disciplinary silos that I dwelt in for the previous decades of my professional life. So I view it as a real privilege to be able to engage with these issues and, more importantly, engage with the people who are also exploring this and discussing these issues.
I can imagine, and that makes total sense. It's interesting how this age of AI really has been pulling people out of sort of that singular discipline space and into a very common conversation, right? One that's bringing everyone together. So we get that. Along those lines, there's been a lot of question as to what is AI, and we all kind of have different definitions. But from your perspective, how would you define what generative AI is?
Sure. Well, generative AI in terms of large language models are simply pattern matches. Okay, so they process vast data sets, but obviously they lack a lot of what we have, right? They lack embodiment, they lack emotion, they lack lived experience, they lack agency, they lack values. But yeah, LLMs are pattern matches.
Well, and you wrote in your piece that people make mistakes about describing LLM. You wrote in The Mind, the Machine, and the Metaphor that the uncritical LLM as mind metaphor tempts us to apply human metrics to AI and obscures the true nature of human thought. Could you elaborate on that further?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, humans always privilege humans, and humans privilege human intelligence, right? And when we see something that generates, fluid text, right, we naturally, in a sort of anthropomorphic sense, say, right, we see some alignment. There's a mirror. There's a mirror here. Now, it's not all our fault. It's not simply the natural tendencies that we have to anthropomorphize. We know that these large language models and their interfaces have been designed to be anthropomorphic, right? They've been designed to ensure that people continually engage with them. Now, there is a rationale for some basic anthropomorphism in design, and that's to do with accessibility, right? But what's really interesting is I would argue that what we've seen to this point is that the anthropomorphism that's built into the design of a lot of these models is probably excessive, more than what is required than needed to support a basic level of accessibility and engagement.
Right. The way that they've modeled these systems and built biases in, they're trying to make them very appealing, trying to build engagement, correct?
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
this kind of brings me back to something that you wrote in, I think, that same essay. You quoted Robert Frost, the poet, as saying that unless you're at home in the metaphor, you're not safe anywhere. And it was just interesting to me how you were able to call on some of these big thinkers of the past. Zarathustra, I think you called on at one point, Robert Frost here, because they kind of anticipated some of the problems that we're running into, didn't they?
Absolutely. And it's interesting that we tend to have a recency bias. If we take a look at writers or thinkers, the newer the better, right? And that's
Mhm.
a behavioral bias that we have. But what's really interesting is that we know that there have been thinkers for thousands of years who've been considering these big questions, right? About what it means to be human, what it means to be good. So these are nothing new. The context has changed, but we have some very useful frameworks that we can turn to. And I think one of the things that points to is that people have been sitting with these questions for a long time, right? These are intergenerational questions, and that hits up against an environment now where people aren't interested in sitting with questions. People want immediate answers, right? And we even know how some of these products have been marketed, right? There was one example, a TV ad where a young child was writing a letter to her favorite sports star, and she did it right through one of these models, right? So the most sort of
Mhm.
natural things you can imagine, a child expressing admiration for someone that they respect and they look up to. The uh, the marketing was, well, this can help, right? This can put words to your thoughts. So people aren't prepared to dwell on things anymore. But we know that there have been questions that have been asked and asked again through the generation. And part of our responsibility, obviously, is to be stewards for those questions. Um,
Mhm.
and in my writing, that's what I attempt to do in some way to continue to steward those intergenerational questions and surface them. And it may be, countercultural in a way, but
Mm,
it feels right, right? It feels right.
I get that. And you just spoke about behavioral bias, and I wanted to kind of dive in here. Why is generative AI's harm a special kind of harm? Like, how does our current context make this situation especially perilous?
That's a great question. I think okay, there's one way of looking at this whole situation, and that is through a model that's referred to as the extended mind. Okay. And the idea is basically humans have always used tools, right?
Yeah.
Humans have always used tools. And the classic example in the extended mind framework is a notebook, right? If we don't want to keep everything in our short term memory, right? We're cognitive misers in a sense. What we can do is we can take a notebook, write down our thoughts, and carry that notebook with us. Okay. So that
Mhm.
in a way, that tool allows us to extend our cognition. Okay. But it's part of us in a sense, right? You can view it almost as a prosthesis, right? LLMs are very, very different because with LLMs, we don't actually have what we can refer to as an extended mind, but we're actually outsourcing some of our cognitive work to something else, right?
Mhm.
Not extending ourselves in terms of sort of broader cognitive extended mind model, but rather we're outsourcing. Okay. And there are some dangers associated with that outsourcing. Okay. Because we know that learning, development is painful, right?
Mhm.
What's interesting is there does need to be a level of struggle, mistake making for neuroplasticity to kick in, right? And it tends to kick in while we sleep to develop the neural connections, right? That enable us to develop. The problem, of course, is that learning can be painful, and the mental pain of trying, failing, can be viewed as akin to physical pain, right? So people want to avoid it, right? People want to avoid it.
Yeah.
Um, now, and that does make perfect sense, but we know that there are lots of other ways that we can frame that. People go to the gym, right? Sweat, right, reflects the effort of becoming healthier, and people recognize that, right? People recognize it as an investment, right? People don't think, I'm lifting weights. I could actually do this so much more easily with a machine that could pick up the weights, right? Well, no, people don't outsource that to machines, right? Because
Yeah.
it's an investment in themselves, right?
Yes.
And we know a lot of young people get that, right? Just
Mhm.
because you use a machine to do something doesn't mean that you should.
Right, right. There was an interesting thing in the news recently that a lot of MIT students were setting up their own poetry clubs to write poetry. And there were no poetry
I saw
classes
that.
they could take on campus. And so they were
Yeah,
writing poetry because they felt that urge to continue to explore, to go to that edge of mind where something wasn't being done for them or being constructed for them. They wanted to feel that kind of that pain of continuing to grow in a capacity that wasn't coming easily to them.
absolutely. I think those elements of learning as being highly social, highly embodied, right, collaborative. I think people still have a real need for
Mhm.
that, and I don't think that will go away. And that was a great article, and I'm a big fan of poetry. I try to slip in a poem or two in my writings,
Yeah.
but I think there is a desire on the part of some college level students, college age students, for a slower experience, for a less digitally connected experience. I wouldn't call it a monastical experience, but gently heading in that direction, right?
Mhm.
Knowing that there are times when you do want to use generative AI, but also, more importantly, knowing when, right, you do not want generative AI. And it's not always clear, right? You don't always have these bright lines. We know that,
Mhm.
technology actually pushes us in a particular direction, right? Technology has its own logic. So
Yeah.
it really is up to us to reflect in sort of a metacognitive sense and think about, right, when should I be using generative AI and when should I just put a pause on that. And we have
Mhm.
similar questions about use of social media and so on. This is part of a broader picture about when is it a good idea to disconnect, right? To return to the embodied, return to the social in terms of face to face, and when does it make sense to offload cognitive?
Yeah, it does remind me of the Neal Stephenson novel Anathem, which I don't know if you've read that, but it's set in a world where there's kind of a monkish culture that studies physics and math at a very deep level. And they don't have much in the way of technology, they don't have much in the way of entertainment. It turns out the world outside the walls is awash with entertainment. And their discipline has been to go deep into certain subjects. And so it sounds like you're almost advocating for the university or academia to help students to go deep instead of being distracted by the shallows.
100%, 100%. I think, yeah, I wouldn't want the entire university experience to be monastical, but I think there are elements of that lifestyle that universities and colleges can help cultivate.
Mhm.
We're up against it. because of the sort of transactional nature of higher education, because of the focus on employability, right? That students will be ready, right, to step into a job and start performing. And, you go back to what the purpose of education really is. And there's a lot that the workplace can actually do to help develop workplace skills, right? It doesn't all fall on the shoulders of the university staff and administrators. What workplaces cannot do is develop those important dispositions, right, that students will need, right, in terms of empathy, persistence, and so on. So I think, the university is a place where some of that deep work, as you put it, has a home, because it won't happen in the workplace. And in fact, employers expect students to arrive, right, with certain dispositions that will enable them to work with others, right? Dispositions that will enable them to deal with uncertainty, right? And that's the tradition of the humanities, right? Sitting with those big questions. I think it's vital. It's vital for students in terms of their personal development, but it's also vital for students in terms of their professional development, really preparing them for life outside the academy, because this is what employers will actually be expecting. There's a lot that you can train graduates for on the job, but those
Sure.
human dispositions cannot be trained for on the job.
Absolutely. Along with academic standards changing, you've also written about changing norms and authorship as well. You offered an interesting point by way of critique, and I'm going to quote you. You said, if ChatGPT produces a sentence that moves you, it proves what theorists have argued for decades. Meaning is not deposited by authors, but created in the act of reading. So, are we actually creating meanings for ourselves in that case?
Yeah, look, this is a really interesting issue. And there have been a lot of studies with comparing how people react to generative AI generated poetry or
Mhm.
prose and human authored prose. And we have some biases for human authored. Okay. And that's got to do with trust and a whole range of other things. But what's interesting, they ask people, what moved you? And they'll pick certain pieces. When they find out those are written by AI, they'll say, "Oh, not so happy with it. Didn't actually move me in the way that I claimed." But look, and I know this is not the purpose of today's chat, but we know that meaning is not something that you stumble over, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have it, right? You don't have a book and you suddenly sort of trip over that book or trip over a few lines and you
Mm.
discover meaning all of a sudden, right? Something meaning is developed, right? Internally through practice, right? Through
Mm.
reflection. And so if there's something that is beautifully written by generative AI, that can still resonate with you. Okay.
Mhm.
So it's more about the reader and less about the author.
Yes.
And I think that does explain why some of these Gen AI sort of therapists or the conversations that people have with Gen I around problems that they may be having really play some sort of role. And there was a great article. I remember it may have been from the New Yorker. A professor was reflecting on his experience of giving his students a task to engage in a conversation with a generative AI model about trust. And there was one student who mentioned that her experience was amazing because she felt that the generative AI model, in terms of the conversation, was actually paying attention in a way that she had not felt for a while with her own
Mhm.
ears, right? That sense of, being seen, being valued, not needing to perform, right? Not needing to wear a mask. And so again, it's got nothing to do with the text that was being produced per se, right? Because there's no intention behind that. So it was how it was received,
Right.
and the meaning that was constructed. And she said she wished that all of her friends could be as attentive as this generative AI model. I think it sort of points to two things. One, it points to the sort of the trained level of sycophancy associated with some of these models,
Right.
uh,
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
and I think that's important. But the flip side is that there's a real craving for people to be seen, to be valued, to be heard. And we talk, quite a bit about the loneliness crisis and the implications that that has on mental health. But talking just in terms of loneliness, I think misses the bigger picture. We're looking for people to pay attention to
Hmm.
us, to see us, to make us feel valued and heard. And the way that some of these models have been designed, it performs that function very well. Of course, the risk is that, relationships, right, need to be cultivated, right? Relationships are full of friction.
Yeah.
So are we, right, preparing young people for an expectation that, you know, it's just smooth sailing?
Right. Your next boyfriend or girlfriend is not going to be as utterly dependent on your every word the way that an LLM that was designed to be that way is going to be. It's not going to be as smooth with everyday human beings.
Well, and
That's
along
right.
those lines, this kind of plays back to your point where most of the good things in life that really make us rich and, strengthen us are hard, right? Most
Hmm.
friendships, I know at least for me, the closest friendships that I have are often people that have gone through hard things with me, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah,
we've shared some struggle and turmoil and like conscious creating of that relationship. So,
100%. Take a look at some of the literature around it. So what does it mean to cultivate a flourishing life? And there's sort of three approaches to a traditional. One is more recent. One is, it's all hedonic, it's all pleasure based, right? If we can only just find pleasure, right, we'll be happier, we'll be more satisfied. The other sort of end of the spectrum is it's not hedonic but eudaimonic, right? It's all about purpose, right? So we've got
Hmm.
to find a purposeful life. But in the middle, and I think this comes back to your point, Kira, is, well, no, what might be most effective in leading to a flourishing life is a life that is psychologically rich. Okay. So a
yeah.
complex sort of life.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think we don't have that psychological richness when we engage with LLMs. We don't have that level of complexity that we need to embrace, that
Hmm.
would lead to a psychologically rich life.
I was just going to mention that the way that you have framed part of this conversation, or this part of the conversation about purpose, goes right back to Aristotle and Plato, right? The basic questions of what makes a good life and how do we interact with each other, and is it all about pleasure or is it all about purpose? I mean, those are the classic questions. It goes to the fact that everybody says that philosophy, modern philosophy, is all footnotes to Plato. And this does bring me, of course, to Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Because you wrote elsewhere that generative AI has destabilized the foundations of everyday epistemology. We no longer kind of know what is true, what's real, but we also, to your point, we may not know what really matters because it's destabilizing our sense of ourselves.
Yeah, good question there. There is a danger that, we start defining ourselves, right, by what generative AI can't do, right? So the
Hmm.
space for an authentically sort of human experience gets smaller and smaller. And there's a real danger there. In part, I think it's because, a lot of the metrics that have been used to evaluate the performance of these models have been sort of human based metrics. And we say, right, it can pass this exam or that exam, right? And as a result, there's no need for humans to engage, right, in those sort of assessments. And if those assessments, in fact, are linked to what is required in a particular job, then there's no need to have people in that job. And I think there's a real danger in using those misleading metrics for a number of reasons. Number one, people like people, right? And we've seen that over the last, let's say, 20, 30 years. So we know when it comes to, for example, chess, right? We know that um, machines have been able to beat humans at chess for a very long time, right? Starting with Deep Blue, right? And going forward. Now, that has not prevented people from playing chess, right? In fact,
Mhm.
chess has seen a renaissance, right? The series, the Queen's Gambit and so on. So just because a machine can do something better than a human can, right, does not crowd out human activity in that space. Because traditionally, we don't assess performance, right, using the same criteria when we compare, let's say, different species, right? So let's say we have, you know, I grew up watching, Michael Phelps, right? Tremendous Olympic swimmer. We don't say, well, you know what? A dolphin can swim faster than Michael Phelps, right? So what's special about Michael Phelps? Maybe we should not focus so much on human competition in the pool because we know there's another species that can do better. We don't do that. We don't do that
Mhm.
when it comes to performance metrics when we look across species. And yet we're doing it when it comes to, for some reason, generative AI. And I think that focus is quite harmful. It's dangerous. It frames things in a way that diminishes us. And, the focus should be on how can we utilize this tool to enhance human flourishing, right? As
Mhm.
opposed to, checking out those weekly metrics, right? On how is this model performing against, a criteria that we use to evaluate human performance.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point. Media historians like Walter Ong and Elizabeth Einstein have taught us to see technological change in terms of disruption. How else could we measure technological change? Like, what are better ways of evaluating technological progress?
Now that is a deep question. Um,
So that's how we roll.
that is great. So yeah, I'll have to sit with that one for a couple of moments. I think again, I would go back to the notion of human flourishing. It's interesting. There are a couple of ways that we could evaluate technology, right? And very often, the way that we evaluate technology is in terms of productivity, is in terms of efficiency, is in terms of time saving, right? Now, is there a correlation between productivity, efficiency, time saving, and human flourishing? Well, I would argue probably at the start, right? So, to get you out of, let's say, a coal mine, right? Where you're working 18 hours a day, right? And you're breathing in all this particulate matter, which is doing terrible damage to your lungs. And it's crowding out time that you could spend with your family, or you could spend, reading or writing or engaging in creative activities. Then yes, there is probably some correlation, right? But I think that correlation disappears after we reach a certain threshold of technological progress. Because what we find is, and particularly this tends to be quite a gendered phenomenon, when we create so-called time-saving appliances for the house, right?
Uh-huh.
It doesn't free up time, right? It just lifts the bar. So if we have, for example, products that can enable us to initially save time on food preparation, right? The idea is no, well, then what we're going to do is we're going to actually make fancier food, right? We're going to spend more time in the kitchen. We're going to make something look better, right?
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
we're going to make a fancier cake, and unfortunately, that does tend to be gendered. And I think the notion of any enhancement of productivity or time saving, right? Should we view that as positive advancement of technology? Like, you're coming back to your question, and I would say no. Uh, because the question is, what are we saving time for? Right?
Yeah.
What are we
Mhm.
actually saving? What are we actually saving time for? And there is some nobility in those small acts that we don't need to be saved from. And I think that's an important point. I think routine and ritual are very important. And if technology frees us or crowds us out from those type of activities, then that would not be, I would claim, a positive move. So again, up until some level of technological development, absolutely, we see strong relationships between all the dimensions of human flourishing and technological progress. But once we hit a certain level of technological progress, I think that that correlation just falls away.
And I think it's interesting, just to step in here, Ned, but I like your point on time saving and really calling out the difference between routine and ritual, right? So there are
Mhm.
times where we're speeding things up. Let's take coffee, for example, and the Keurig, right?
Ah,
So
yeah,
so back when I would do, more of the espresso style coffee and make my coffee, there was this sense of ritual. You ground the beans to a certain degree, you tamp it just so, you let it flow, and like that as the coffee comes out, you can tell the quality of it, right? And it became a part of my morning ritual, right?
yes,
But then having technology that just lets you speed it up, right, gives me more time back to my day, and you pop the Keurig thing in there and you go, right? You're you're right, I see your point, like,
yeah.
my
Kira,
ritual's
I
not
feel
quite there.
I don't know how long this camera has been on for, but I feel seen because making coffee is my morning ritual. That's the
Really?
first that is what I do in the morning. That is in fact what grounds me. So I have a
Mm.
semi-automatic machine, but with all those settings, you've got to choose, right, how much you're going to grind it, right? Got to temper it. You've got to make a whole range of choices, right? In terms of how you're going to make the coffee. And I find it probably the most important grounding ritual of my morning. Yeah, yeah. I feel very seen.
Right,
Beautiful.
right, and not to wax too philosophical, not that we've done that at all on this
No,
episode, but as the Western world kind of drifts away from being grounded in church and faith, the idea of sacred ritual has really kind of left the building. And we really need to reclaim that sense of ritualizing and sacralizing everyday experience in order to understand its meaning important in our lives. That's my speech for the moment. But as we continue to move forward, I don't think artificial intelligence is going away. So,
yeah.
how do we build a future that includes artificial intelligence, but is maybe more coherent and more conscious about what we're doing?
So I mean, there are a few things off the top of my head. Number one, we want to protect some core practices,
Mhm.
and that might be spending deep reading and so on, face to face interaction, right? Incredibly important. Social learning. We want to make sure that we use AI and critique AI. Okay. So I think students need some hands on AI fluency that can support critical reflection on its influence. So I think that's really important. I think ensuring that we are focused on autonomy, right? Cultivating autonomy, I think that's incredibly important. AI and also intrinsic motivation. Right? AI will only be useful in an educational setting if students are intrinsically motivated, right? Otherwise, they'll just cognitively offload, right? And how you get students motivated about developing their cognitive selves, right, is not as easy as getting them to the gym, right?
Mhm.
So, how do we motivate students, right, to develop themselves cognitively in the same way that many young people, right, will go out to the gym and really focus on sort of the type of practices that we actually know work for learning, right? So, sort of spaced practice, right? Interleaving, right? Testing yourself at regular points. All of these things work for learning. They also work when you're in the gym working with weights. And how can we get students to simply transfer a lot of those practices to learning? And it's all about motivation, which is super difficult. But I think that's something that we've got to focus on. I think imagining is very, very important. One could take the attitude that, okay, we're just going to resist, right? We're just going to shut the door. But Ned, I think, you alluded to the fact that it's not going to go
Mhm.
away. And so, we can take the time to, in terms of education, to rethink pedagogy, to rethink assessment, to rethink learning activities in a very, very positive. And that happened in COVID, right? When we had COVID, and we had emergency remote teaching, right? We were really offered a provocation. And that is, once COVID ended, right, in terms of the pandemic, the question was, what do we take with us and what do we leave behind, in a very, very mindful way? And I think we need to be asking those questions as well now, right? What do we value from the pre AI times, right? What do we want to still carry with us? But there may be things that actually we want to leave behind. So it's very much a provocation. I think we need to sit with those questions for a while. I think the other big thing, obviously, in education, is really focusing on, and I wrote a Substack piece on this, focusing on process, not just product,
Mhm.
and really allow students to appreciate the fact that learning is emergent, and give them the sense that mistakes are important. They're all part of the learning. They're all part of the learning process. I'm not necessarily talking about ungrading or anything like that. But how do we align the academic experience of students with their learning experience, with how we know actually learning works, rather than chopping up their academic experience into very discrete courses, subjects, right? You tested on them, you move on to the next, right?
Mhm.
What about the North Star of education? Well, one of the North Stars, which is the transfer, right, of those knowledge and skills to novel and uncertain contexts. A greater focus on that, I think. It's
Yeah.
not easy, and I know people have been thinking about this before, well before ChatGPT arrived, but there's renewed focus, right? And how do we focus on the process rather than the end product? Being mindful, of course, that we don't want to continually sort of monitor students, and that's a pejorative sense, because that's a danger as well. But how can we,
Mhm.
with care, really support students on their emergent learning journey and align the experience that we design for students to how we know learning actually works over time?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be a really interesting world where we try to look for a new balance between getting it right, being
Yeah.
productive. So getting it right, getting it done, and actually
Yes.
that process of inquiry and learning and, maybe distinguishing the difference of right and wrong and eliminating wrong, right? So wrong answer. But did you think critically? Did you spark discussion? Did you get engagement? And so I think that'll be
Absolutely.
really interesting, and we're finding that conversation is popping up a lot in the creative world too, and people
Absolutely.
exploring creativity.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big things now will be, getting students to ask better questions. I think that's absolutely, absolutely vital. In higher education, for a long time, students have been given assessments, right, with very clear answers. But now that, and I know there's obviously hallucination and so on, but now that they can source answers in a second, what's more important is that the questions that we ask are relevant, are meaning, reflect what we're prioritizing. So I think asking
Mhm.
meaningful questions is going to be very, very important, not just in higher education, but in the workplace as well. I think will be absolutely critical. But we don't get students to design their own questions, right? Unless you take that inquiry-based approach to education, which has some part to play in a good sort of primary education, but it's not enough. And the other piece is, the need for us to cultivate skills related to evaluative judgment. Okay, so we need to strengthen. The idea is you have a PhD in your pocket, right? You don't need to know anything. It's like an extension of that sort of the Google, right? The Google effect. But if we are going to be able to evaluate the outputs of these models, we have to develop some mastery of the different disciplinary areas that we use the models for. So I think not, when I said, what do we keep? What do we leave behind? Right. One thing that we definitely want to keep, right, is the development of mastery in particular areas, because that is crucial for evaluative judgment. And, going full circle, is generative AI undermining the pathways that we've normally taken to mastery? And that is something that is very challenging, and that's something that's challenging us every day in higher education.
Well, on that note, I think we'll have to wrap up. We're out of time, but what a fascinating conversation. Thank you for this engagement and discussion, Dr. Boymal.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You can find out more about any of these news items and hear the complete interview on the extended premium version of our podcast at humanintelligence.news. Today's episode was produced by Ned Hayes and engineered by Muhammad Adnan. Our analog-only human-themed music was created for the Human Intelligence podcast by Josh Pinkston of Nature and Spirit. This episode, and every episode, is brought to you by the Human Intelligence Institute team. That's all for Human Intelligence. Thanks for listening to today's episode. As always, this episode is available online at humanintelligence.news.